What if history is not missing pieces by accident but by design? Not torn away in violence, but gently smoothed over, like footprints erased by an incoming tide. There is a strange silence in our story as a species, a pause where memory should be, a shadow where origins ought to stand. We sense it when ruins feel older than their dates, when myths sound less like fantasy and more like recollection. Tonight is not about answers. It is about listening to what refuses to disappear. So before you drift too far, take a moment to like this video and subscribe, only if what you hear truly resonates with you. And if you feel inclined, share your location and local time. It reminds us how scattered yet connected we are. Settle in now. This is Deformed History. And this journey begins where certainty ends. There is a subtle tension that runs through the deepest layers of the past, a pressure felt only when one lingers too long between the lines of accepted timelines. It emerges in moments when geology speaks more slowly than history allows, when stone seems to remember a longer story than our charts are willing to record. The surface narrative of civilization moves forward with confidence, but beneath it lies an older rhythm, uneven and unresolved, marked by interruptions that feel less like gradual change and more like sudden forgetting. In the official story, humanity rises carefully and incrementally. Hunter-gatherers linger for tens of thousands of years, learning patience, learning survival, and then, almost politely, step into agriculture, architecture, and abstraction. Yet the ground itself resists this smooth ascent. Sediment layers reveal violent shifts in climate that appear too abrupt, too synchronized across continents to be dismissed as local accidents. Ice cores preserve chemical signatures of atmospheric chaos, spikes of dust and ash that suggest the sky itself once turned hostile. These events are acknowledged, catalogued, and then quietly isolated from the cultural record, as if environmental catastrophe and human memory were never meant to meet. Archaeology, at its edges, tells a stranger story than its textbooks. Tools appear where they should not, crafted with a sophistication that does not align neatly with their assigned era. Stone spheres shaped with near-perfect symmetry emerge from ancient strata, their purpose unclear, their precision uncomfortable. Walls are uncovered whose foundations sink deeper into time than the civilizations credited with building them, as though later cultures inherited the ruins of something they barely understood. These anomalies are not denied outright. They are reclassified, contextualized, softened, until their disruptive potential fades. The discomfort does not come from the artifacts themselves, but from what they imply. If certain forms of knowledge existed earlier than allowed, then the linear narrative begins to bend. If societies once organized labor, astronomy, and symbolic language on a scale previously reserved for later ages, then the silence that follows their disappearance demands attention. The absence becomes louder than any remaining structure. One does not need imaginary civilizations or fantastical technologies to feel this unease. The evidence already present, scattered and incomplete, is enough to suggest interruption rather than origin. Geology reinforces this sense of rupture. There are moments in Earth's recent past marked by rapid sea level rise, sudden temperature swings, and mass extinctions that do not align comfortably with gradualist expectations. Meltwater pulses transform coastlines in generations rather than millennia. Entire ecosystems collapse and reassemble under new rules. For mobile hunter-gatherers, such changes might mean adaptation. For sedentary or semi-sedentary societies, they would mean erasure. Coastal settlements vanish beneath rising seas, leaving no trace but memory, and memory, when carried orally, becomes myth. It is here that the boundary between science and story begins to blur. Myths of lost lands, of great deluges and burning skies appear across cultures separated by oceans and languages. Officially, these are symbolic expressions, moral tales, or psychological archetypes. Yet they persist with a stubborn consistency, describing not just destruction, but prior order. Cities, laws, measurements, and transgressions remembered through metaphor. The question of whether myth encodes experience is often sidestepped, not because it lacks merit, but because it complicates the clean separation between prehistory and history. Academic caution is understandable. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and speculation has often overreached itself in the past. But caution can harden into habit. When anomalies are always explained away rather than examined as part of a pattern, a different kind of bias takes root. The possibility of cultural discontinuity, of collapse followed by reinvention, remains theoretically acceptable but practically ignored. Civilization, in this view, must always move forward, never reset, never forget enough to start again with fragments. There is also the matter of scale. The deeper one looks, the more compressed time becomes. 10,000 years shrink against the backdrop of human evolution, and yet that same span is treated as an absolute boundary for complex organization. This contradiction is rarely addressed. Humans capable of symbolic thought, long-distance navigation, and intricate social structures existed far earlier than their monumental expressions suggest. The absence of stone cities does not equal the absence of civilization. It may instead reflect materials lost to time, environments reclaimed by water, or traditions deliberately abandoned after failure. Some researchers have begun to speak more openly about these fractures, not in declarations, but in careful footnotes, in phrasing that acknowledges uncertainty rather than suppressing it. They note that the archaeological record is not a complete archive, but a biased survivor, favoring stone over wood, dry climates over wet, catastrophe over continuity. They recognize that what we call the beginning may simply be the beginning of what endured. And then there is the human element. Knowledge does not vanish evenly. In every known collapse, something survives, often in reduced form. Techniques become rituals, measurements become symbols, stories become warnings. A society rebuilding after devastation does not announce itself as a continuation, it presents itself as a dawn. Over generations, the memory of what came before fades into reverence or taboo. Eventually, it is safer to call it myth. The anomalies remain, quiet but persistent. They do not demand belief, only attention. They suggest that history may be less like a ladder and more like a shoreline, shaped by advances and retreats, each wave erasing the neat lines drawn by the last. If that is so, then our current position becomes harder to define, not as the first to arrive, but as the latest to inherit what remains. There is a sense, when standing before ruins older than their explanations, that one is not looking at a beginning, but at a remainder. Something left behind unintentionally, something that survived long enough to be misattributed. and in that misattribution lies comfort, a belief that the past is simpler than the present, that complexity is our exclusive achievement, that collapse is something that happens to others. This comfort is fragile. It depends on silence where there may have once been voices, on gaps framed as ignorance rather than loss. The deeper record does not scream its secrets. It waits. And as each anomaly accumulates, the shape of absence grows clearer, like negative space revealing a hidden form. Whatever once occupied that space did not disappear without consequence. It left echoes, and those echoes are beginning to align. The ground beneath history is not empty. It is layered, fractured, and unfinished. And the story it hints at has only begun to surface. Knowledge rarely announces its arrival. It seeps into the record quietly, often already formed, already functional, as if it had been waiting for the right moment to surface. This is the unease that grows when examining the early chapters of civilization, not as a triumphant awakening, but as an inheritance whose origins remain obscured. The transition from wandering bands to settled societies appears in textbooks as a gradual awakening. Yet the evidence suggests a sharper edge, a sudden coherence that feels less like invention and more like recollection. Agriculture is often framed as humanity's first great leap, a slow domestication of plants and animals guided by trial and error. But the earliest agricultural systems emerge with an efficiency that resists simplicity. Crops appear already optimized, genetically distinct from their wild ancestors, requiring precise seasonal timing and long-term planning. Such systems demand shared calendars, stable social organization, and knowledge of cycles that extend beyond a single lifetime. These are not accidental developments. They imply a depth of understanding that seems to precede the moment it becomes visible. The same tension appears in early astronomy. The sky becomes a tool almost immediately. Long before written language stabilizes, celestial movements are tracked with remarkable accuracy. Solstices and equinoxes are identified, eclipses anticipated, and long-term cycles embedded into ritual and architecture. This knowledge does not emerge as scattered observation, but as integrated systems, often aligned across vast regions. Stones are placed not randomly, but with intention that assumes familiarity with the heavens over generations. The sky, it seems, was already known. Architecture deepens the discomfort. The earliest monumental structures are not crude experiments. They are confident, purposeful, and symbolically loaded. Large-scale construction requires coordination, geometry, and an understanding of materials that transcends survival needs. Foundations are laid with awareness of load distribution and environmental stress. Proportions reflect mathematical relationships that later cultures would formalize but did not invent. These buildings do not feel like first attempts. They feel like statements made by societies that already understood what they were doing. This convergence of agriculture, astronomy, and architecture within a relatively compressed span of time challenges the notion of independent, gradual discovery. Each domain reinforces the others. Farming depends on seasonal knowledge. Astronomy depends on observation and record-keeping. Architecture depends on measurement and planning. Together, they form a coherent package of civilization that appears almost fully assembled. The gaps between these developments are narrow, as though the underlying framework already existed, waiting only for conditions to allow its expression. The standard explanation invokes necessity. Population pressure, environmental stability, and social competition are said to drive innovation. Yet necessity alone does not explain refinement. It does not account for symbolic systems layered onto practical ones, for mythologies that encode technical knowledge, or for ceremonial structures aligned with events that offer no immediate survival advantage. These choices suggest memory, continuity, and values shaped by something more than immediate adaptation. Language offers another clue. Early writing systems appear abruptly, already capable of abstraction. Symbols represent sounds, concepts, and quantities with internal logic that implies prolonged experimentation. Writing is not merely a record of trade or harvests. It carries cosmology, law, and identity. The leap from oral tradition to structured script is immense, yet it occurs rapidly in multiple regions. Such parallel emergence hints at shared cognitive frameworks rather than isolated breakthroughs. What if the appearance of sudden knowledge reflects not the birth of civilization, but its resurfacing? In this view, what emerges after periods of disruption is not innovation from nothing, but reconstruction from fragments. Survivors carry partial understanding forward, adapting it to new circumstances, simplifying what can no longer be maintained, preserving what still matters. Over time, these fragments recombine, giving the impression of rapid advancement where there was, in fact, continuity interrupted. This interpretation reframes the role of myth. Creation stories cease to be naive explanations and become coded memories of loss and renewal. The gods who teach farming, writing, and law appear across cultures, often described as arriving after chaos, bringing order back to a broken world. These figures are dismissed as symbolic, yet their functions are consistent. They do not invent humanity, they restore it. They do not create knowledge, they return it. There is an unease in accepting this possibility because it destabilizes progress as a one-way path. It suggests that knowledge can be forgotten on a civilizational scale, that complexity is not guaranteed, and that survival does not ensure continuity of understanding. The archaeological record supports this discomfort. Long periods exist where human presence is clear, but evidence of advanced organization is absent. These gaps are treated as blank slates rather than erasures. Modern assumptions often project inevitability backward. Once writing exists, it seems obvious that it would emerge. Once cities stand, their appearance feels natural. But inevitability is an illusion created by survival. What endures defines what is remembered. What fails disappears, taking its experiments and insights with it. The suddenness of early knowledge may reflect the narrow window through which it re-enters visibility, not the moment of its conception. The refinement of early tools reinforces this view. Polished stone implements, standardized in form and function, appear with little evidence of iterative development. Their makers understood ergonomics, material properties, and efficiency. These tools are not random solutions. They are optimized responses to specific needs. Optimization implies comparison, memory, and accumulated experience. It implies a past rich enough to be distilled. The resistance to this interpretation often stems from fear of speculation. Yet, speculation is not required to acknowledge discontinuity. It is enough to observe that the record is uneven, that knowledge clusters abruptly, and that explanations relying solely on gradualism strain under the weight of evidence. The story becomes clearer when collapse is allowed to exist alongside creation. Civilization, then, is not a singular event but a recurring condition, fragile and contingent. Knowledge survives through people, not monuments, and when those people are lost or scattered, understanding thins. What returns later may look new, but it carries the imprint of what came before. The suddenness is not miraculous, it is the speed of remembering. These patterns do not demand a forgotten golden age or a vanished super-society. They demand only recognition that human history is capable of deep amnesia, that memory, like stone, erodes under pressure, that what appears as a beginning may instead be the echo of an ending. The emergence of early civilization reads differently when seen through this lens, not as humanity's first step forward, but as a cautious reassembly after something unnamed. The confidence embedded in early systems suggests familiarity, not discovery, and familiarity implies prior loss. What was forgotten may never be fully recovered, but the shape of forgetting leaves traces in sudden knowledge, in coherent systems without clear ancestry, in the quiet sense that something once known has been remembered again, just enough to begin. Stone is an unforgiving medium. It does not yield easily, does not tolerate error, and remembers every strike made against it. This is why the earliest monumental stonework carries such weight in the story of civilization. It is not merely old, it is precise. And precision implies intent, planning, and knowledge that cannot be improvised. When examining ancient masonry, the discomfort does not come from its age alone, but from the quiet competence it displays at moments where incompetence would be expected. Across the ancient world, massive stone blocks are fitted together with seams so tight that modern tools struggle to replicate them. These are not symbolic approximations of architecture. They are engineered surfaces, flattened and aligned with an attention to tolerance measured in millimeters. The stones are often irregular in shape, yet interlock flawlessly, distributing weight in ways that resist seismic stress. This technique appears independently in distant regions, separated by oceans and epochs, yet unified by an understanding of stone behavior that feels standardized rather than experimental. The conventional explanation relies on labor. Enough time, enough hands, enough patience. But labor alone does not generate accuracy. Precision is not a function of force, it is a function of measurement, planning, and feedback. To shape stone at scale requires foresight, knowledge of angles, pressure points, fracture lines, and tool limitations. It requires the ability to visualize a finished structure before the first block is moved. This level of foresight is rarely acknowledged in descriptions of early builders, who are often portrayed as resourceful but unsophisticated. Tool marks complicate this narrative further. In many ancient sites, the marks left on stone surfaces do not align neatly with the tools attributed to their makers. Surfaces are smoothed in ways that suggest abrasion techniques more consistent than simple pounding. Curves are executed with symmetry that implies guides or templates. Drill holes exhibit uniform diameters and depths, hinting at controlled rotation rather than opportunistic chiseling. These observations are not sensational claims. They are documented details that sit quietly in excavation reports, rarely elevated to interpretive significance. Stone transport presents another challenge. Some blocks weigh tens, even hundreds of tons, quarried from distant sources and placed with remarkable accuracy. The logistics of such movement demand coordination, terrain management, and an understanding of leverage and friction that goes beyond improvisation. Explanations often invoke sledges, rollers, and manpower, yet the consistency of placement suggests systems rather than ad hoc solutions. The stones arrive not just anywhere, but exactly where they are needed, aligned with broader architectural and symbolic schemes. What unsettles is not the possibility that ancient people were capable of great feats. It is the reluctance to consider that their capabilities may have been underestimated by design. The narrative of progress benefits from portraying the past as crude. It reinforces a sense of modern exceptionalism. Yet stone does not conform to ideology. It preserves evidence impartially, indifferent to the stories told about it. There is also the matter of foundation layers. In several ancient sites, the lowest courses of stonework are the most sophisticated, while later additions are visibly cruder. This inversion of expectation suggests inheritance rather than innovation. Later builders appear to work around existing foundations, sometimes reusing them without fully understanding their original purpose. The structure becomes a palimpsest, with the oldest layer setting constraints that subsequent cultures adapt to rather than redefine. This pattern challenges the assumption that complexity increases monotonically over time. Instead, it suggests moments of peak capability followed by decline and reuse. Stonework becomes a fossilized record of these fluctuations. Where knowledge persists, precision remains. Where it fades, form survives without function, and imitation replaces understanding. The question of how such precision was achieved is often deflected by emphasizing what is unknown. Unknown tools, unknown techniques, unknown methods. But ignorance should not be mistaken for impossibility. The absence of surviving tools does not imply their non-existence. Perishable materials vanish. Specialized knowledge disappears when its practitioners do. What remains is the result, stripped of its context, inviting speculation, but also demanding humility. There is a deeper implication embedded in this stone. Precision architecture requires social stability. It requires time not spent on survival, resources allocated to non-essential construction, and a shared belief in continuity. Those conditions imply societies more complex than their material culture alone suggests. They imply planning horizons that extend beyond individual lifespans and value systems that justify monumental effort for symbolic ends. Such societies do not arise overnight. They are cultivated. And cultivation implies prior generations, traditions, and accumulated experience. When these structures appear early in the archaeological record, they strain the idea of spontaneous emergence. They hint at preparation, at a prehistory richer than the fragments we possess. The response to this tension has often been compartmentalization. Stonework is admired aesthetically, but isolated from broader cultural interpretation. It becomes an anomaly, a curiosity, rather than a data point with narrative weight. This approach preserves the linear model by treating precision as an exception rather than evidence. Yet exceptions accumulate. Each precisely cut block, each impossibly tight joint, each foundation that predates its attributed builders adds to a quiet chorus of contradiction. The chorus does not shout. It murmurs. It asks for reconsideration not through drama, but through consistency. There is restraint in stone. It does not exaggerate. It does not lie. It records effort faithfully. When that effort exceeds the expectations placed upon its makers, the burden shifts to interpretation. Either the past is more capable than allowed, or the timeline is incomplete. In this light, ancient stonework becomes more than architecture. It becomes testimony, a record of knowledge applied deliberately and confidently, a sign that some builders worked from principles rather than guesses, that they knew what they were doing, and did it well enough that their work endures long after their names have faded. The precision is not a mystery demanding exotic explanations. It is a reminder that knowledge, once lost, leaves behind artifacts that outlast understanding, and when those artifacts resurface, they unsettle comfortable narratives. They suggest that what we call beginnings may be rebuilds, and what we call primitives may be heirs. Stone remains, patient and exact, waiting for the story around it to catch up. Maps are supposed to clarify the world. They draw lines where uncertainty once lived and replace speculation with proportion and scale. Yet some of the oldest surviving maps do the opposite. Instead of reinforcing the accepted shape of history, they disturb it, quietly introducing details that appear out of place, as if memory had slipped through the grid lines unnoticed. Among early cartographic works, there exist charts that depict coastlines with an accuracy that should not belong to their time. These maps show continents not as vague outlines, but as measured forms, complete with bays, capes, and inland features rendered with surprising confidence. What unsettles historians is not artistry, but precision. Certain coastlines appear free of ice long before official chronologies allow for such conditions. The land seems remembered as it once was, not as it should have been known. The explanation often rests on compilation. Later mapmakers, it is said, gathered fragments from many sources, some older than others, merging them into composite works. This is plausible, yet it only shifts the mystery backward. If these fragments existed, they must have been drawn from observations made in environments inaccessible to the cultures credited with preserving them. The accuracy does not disappear under scrutiny. It deepens. Longitude presents a particular problem. Determining latitude is relatively straightforward with stellar observation, but longitude requires precise timekeeping or long-term astronomical reference. This capability is officially associated with much later periods. Yet some ancient maps display proportional accuracy east to west that implies a grasp of longitudinal measurement beyond accepted limits. The lines hold their shape across vast distances, suggesting more than guesswork. These maps are often dismissed as anomalies or misinterpretations. Critics emphasize distortions elsewhere on the same charts, uneven scales, symbolic embellishments. Yet distortion does not negate intention. A map can be flawed and still preserve accurate data within its framework. The presence of error does not erase the presence of knowledge. It reveals prioritization. Certain features mattered more than others. What makes these maps particularly unsettling is their lack of spectacle. They do not announce forbidden knowledge or declare lost worlds. They sit quietly in archives, studied but rarely integrated into the broader narrative. Their implications are inconvenient. If coastlines were charted before ice returned, then someone was there to see them. If someone was there to see them, then habitation preceded catastrophe. Glaciology offers context that archaeology struggles to absorb. Ice sheets expand and retreat in pulses, not smooth transitions. During warmer intervals, regions now buried beneath ice would have been exposed, navigable, and habitable. Shorelines would have extended farther outward, river systems reshaped, and land bridges emerged. These were not brief moments. They spanned generations, long enough for settlement, travel, and memory. When sea levels rise rapidly, coastlines vanish first. The archaeological record favors high ground, not because civilization avoided the sea, but because the sea reclaimed its margins. Entire cultures could disappear without leaving stone cities behind. Wood rots. Earth erodes. What survives is what was built to resist water, and much early habitation would not qualify. Cartography becomes a form of fossilized observation. A coastline drawn once and copied many times can outlive the culture that first recorded it. Each replication distances the image from its origin, until the map becomes an artifact without ancestry. Later generations inherit the drawing, but forget the conditions under which it was made. This pattern mirrors the broader problem of deep history. What survives is not representative. It is selective. The absence of evidence becomes mistaken for evidence of absence. Maps challenge this assumption by preserving information that should not exist if the timeline were complete. They suggest that observation preceded explanation, that knowledge lingered even as its context faded. There is also the question of orientation. Some ancient maps align north differently than expected, using reference points tied to stars or solar paths rather than magnetic direction. This choice reflects a worldview grounded in the sky rather than the compass. It implies consistent astronomical observation and a relationship between land and heavens that transcends local navigation. Such alignment reinforces the impression of a culture comfortable thinking in planetary terms. Resistance to these implications often takes the form of compartmentalization. Cartography is treated as a separate discipline, insulated from archaeology and climatology. Maps become curiosities rather than witnesses. Their data is acknowledged but not allowed to inform the larger story. This preserves coherence at the cost of completeness. The deeper discomfort lies in what these maps imply about loss. Knowledge was not merely primitive and then improved. It was present, then obscured, then partially remembered. The lines on these charts act like scars, traces of something removed but not entirely erased. They persist because copying is easier than comprehension. A map can be replicated without understanding why it looks the way it does. In this light, ancient cartography resembles myth in visual form. Both compress experience into symbols. Both survive disruption by shedding detail. Both carry truth in fragments rather than narratives. And both become suspect when judged by standards that assume continuity rather than collapse. Modern technology has confirmed some of these ancient outlines. Satellite imagery reveals submerged coastlines that align with older maps more closely than with current geography. These confirmations are treated cautiously, often framed as coincidence or creative interpretation. Yet coincidence loses force as alignment accumulates. Patterns begin to form, not dramatic enough to force revision, but persistent enough to invite reconsideration. Maps do not invent land. They record it. Even when stylized, they reflect an attempt to describe space as it was experienced. When that experience no longer matches the world as it exists, the map becomes an artifact of another time, not a prophecy, but a memory. The memory encoded in these charts does not demand a vanished empire or global dominion. It demands only presence, eyes that saw, hands that measured, minds that cared enough to preserve what they observed. The disappearance of those minds does not negate their observations. It leaves them orphaned. The world has changed its shape before. Ice has returned and retreated. Seas have risen and fallen. Human societies have adapted, migrated, and sometimes failed. The maps that survive do not resist this story. They confirm it quietly by refusing to conform to simpler versions of the past. What they offer is not certainty, but orientation. A reminder that the land beneath our feet has worn many faces, and that some of those faces were known, charted, and then lost. The lines remain, faint but deliberate, waiting for the silence around them to be acknowledged. Flood stories endure because water erases without prejudice. It does not negotiate with borders, beliefs, or memory. When it arrives, it flattens distinctions, turning cities and fields into the same indistinct surface. This quality makes flood narratives uniquely persistent across cultures, not as identical retellings, but as variations of a shared trauma that refuses to settle into silence. Across continents, ancient traditions speak of a time when waters rose beyond their bounds and reordered the world. These accounts are often relegated to the category of myth, their similarities explained away as symbolic coincidence or moral allegory. Yet when examined closely, the consistency lies not in moral framing, but in structure. The floods come suddenly. They follow a period of imbalance. They erase a previous order that was advanced enough to warrant judgment or regret. Survivors carry fragments forward, not triumphantly, but cautiously. Geological evidence offers a parallel narrative that unfolds without poetry. At the end of the last glacial period, melting ice sheets released vast quantities of fresh water into the oceans. Sea levels rose not gradually, but in pulses, overwhelming coastlines and river valleys within human timescales. Entire regions that had supported life for generations disappeared beneath expanding seas. This was not a single event, but a series of disruptions that transformed geography repeatedly. For communities living along fertile shores and deltas, these changes would have been catastrophic. Early settlement patterns favored water access, trade routes, and predictable seasonal flooding. When those patterns broke, the loss would have been total. Habitats vanished, resources scattered, knowledge tied to place became obsolete overnight. Survival required movement, adaptation, and simplification. Oral tradition thrives in such conditions. When writing systems collapse or never existed, memory becomes portable. Stories compress experience into narrative frameworks that can be carried across generations. The flood becomes more than an event. It becomes a boundary marker between worlds, before and after. Known and unknown, ordered and uncertain. The shared elements across flood myths point less toward imagination and more toward lived reality. The emphasis on destruction rather than renewal. The portrayal of prior societies as organized, lawful, and sometimes arrogant. The preservation of specific knowledge through chosen survivors. These are not features designed to entertain. They function as warnings and explanations, anchoring identity in loss rather than conquest. What is often overlooked is the technical detail embedded within these narratives. References to measurements, calendars, and constructions appear not as central themes, but as remnants. boats built to precise specifications, mountains named as points of refuge, timelines counted in days and nights. These details persist even as surrounding context becomes symbolic. They hint at an original account that was once more literal, later abstracted through retelling. Modern resistance to interpreting these stories as memory rather than metaphor stems from discomfort with scale. Accepting widespread flood events implies acknowledging widespread cultural disruption. It implies that human history includes episodes of near-total reset, where continuity fractured and complexity thinned. This challenges the comfort of linear progress and stable inheritance. Archaeology struggles with water. Submerged sites are difficult to access, expensive to study, and often legally protected in ways that limit exploration. As a result, the underwater past remains underrepresented in the record. What little is found tends to confirm habitation rather than challenge it, reinforcing the idea that absence is simply due to inaccessibility, not non-existence. Flood myths fill this gap with persistence. They survive precisely because they do not depend on material remains. They encode experience in rhythm, repetition, and imagery. They allow communities to remember without rebuilding. Over time, the stories adapt to new environments, incorporating local features while preserving core structure. This adaptability ensures survival, even as literal interpretation fades. There is also a psychological dimension. Collective trauma imprints itself differently than ordinary memory. It resists detail, but preserves emotion. Fear, awe, and humility remain long after specifics blur. Flood narratives often emphasize helplessness before natural forces, a reminder of vulnerability that contrasts sharply with stories of conquest and dominance. This emotional core aligns closely with what would be expected from societies overwhelmed by environmental change. Scientific discourse tends to separate myth from data, yet the boundary is not as rigid as assumed. Both attempt to describe reality through available means. One relies on measurement, the other on meaning. When material evidence is erased, meaning becomes the only survivor. Dismissing it entirely risks discarding the last trace of events that shaped entire populations. The convergence of flood myths with geological timelines is not perfect, but it is suggestive. Peaks in sea level rise align broadly with periods of cultural transition. Settlement patterns shift inland. Toolkits simplify before diversifying again. Symbolic systems emphasize rebirth and order restoration. These patterns reflect adaptation after loss, not spontaneous invention. There is no need to claim that every flood story refers to the same event. Water rises locally as well as globally. Rivers overflow. Lakes burst their bounds. But the persistence of the motif across isolated cultures points to shared vulnerability rather than shared imagination. The world has flooded many times, and each time it has taken knowledge with it. What remains afterward is never identical to what came before. Survivors rebuild using fragments, guided by memory and necessity. Over generations, the memory of the flood becomes a story. The story becomes a myth. The myth becomes suspect. Yet beneath each transformation, the original experience leaves an imprint that resists erasure. The flood, then, is not merely a story about water. It is a story about interruption, about the fragility of systems that feel permanent until they are not, about knowledge that assumes stability and fails under change. In this sense, flood myths serve as cultural fossils, preserving the outline of events that material evidence struggles to retain. As these narratives persist, they form a connective tissue between past and present, reminding each generation that the ground beneath certainty can shift without warning. They do not explain everything. They do not demand belief. They endure because they resonate with patterns the earth itself continues to repeat. The waters recede, but they leave behind a silence that speaks louder than ruins. And within that silence, memory continues its quiet work, reshaping loss into story, and story into something that refuses to disappear. The hill did not announce itself. For decades, it was dismissed as just another rise in the landscape. Shaped by wind and time, its stones assumed to be the debris of later occupation. What lay beneath remained untouched, not because it was hidden, but because it contradicted expectation. When excavation finally began, it became clear that this place did not fit where it was found in history. It belonged to a time officially defined as incapable of producing it. The structures uncovered were monumental in scale and deliberate in design. Massive stone pillars stood upright, some weighing many tons, arranged in circular enclosures with a precision that suggested planning rather than improvisation. These were not shelters. They were not defensive works. They were symbolic constructions, rich with carved imagery, abstract yet intentional, depicting animals, movement, and narrative in stone. Their creators were not farmers. They left no evidence of agriculture. They were hunter-gatherers, at least by every conventional classification. This contradiction unsettles the foundation of accepted chronology. Monumental architecture has long been tied to surplus. Surplus implies agriculture. Agriculture implies settlement. Settlement implies hierarchy and specialization. Yet here stood a site that inverted the sequence. Large-scale construction appeared before farming, before pottery, before permanent villages. The builders gathered, planned, carved, and erected stone with a level of coordination previously thought impossible for their way of life. The labor involved alone demands reconsideration. Quarrying, shaping, transporting, and erecting pillars of this size requires organization, leadership, and shared purpose. It requires a reason strong enough to justify sustained effort over time. Such effort implies belief systems complex enough to motivate cooperation beyond immediate survival. The site does not reflect a society experimenting with symbolism. It reflects one fluent in it. The carvings deepen this impression. The animals depicted are not random decorations. They appear in deliberate groupings, repeated across structures with variation and consistency. Some are predators. Others are abstracted into symbols that resist simple interpretation. The imagery suggests narrative or cosmology rather than ornamentation. It encodes meaning that was important enough to preserve in the most durable medium available. What makes this even more striking is what followed. After centuries of use, the site was deliberately buried, not abandoned, not destroyed by catastrophe, carefully filled in, enclosure by enclosure, sealed beneath layers of earth. This act required as much effort as construction itself. It suggests intention, closure, and possibly protection. Whatever knowledge or function the site held, it wasn't meant to erode naturally. It was meant to be hidden. This burial challenges assumptions about progress. A society capable of creating such a place did not transition smoothly into what followed. Instead, complexity appears to retreat. Later cultures in the region adopted agriculture, built settlements, and developed technologies, yet nothing of this symbolic scale reappeared for millennia. The peak came early. What followed was adaptation, not continuation. The implications ripple outward. If hunter-gatherers could organize monumental construction, then the boundary between foraging and civilization becomes unstable. It suggests that social complexity does not depend solely on subsistence strategy. Belief, memory, and shared identity can mobilize people as effectively as surplus grain. This reframes early human capability as flexible rather than primitive. The site also forces reconsideration of motivation. There is no clear utilitarian function. The structures do not provide shelter or storage. They do not defend territory. Their purpose appears ceremonial, symbolic, or observational. This implies that early societies invested heavily in meaning, not just survival. They gathered not to eat, but to remember, to mark something important enough to justify stone. The timing matters. The site dates to a period of significant climatic change as the world transitioned out of the last glacial phase. Environments were shifting, resources were redistributing, stability was uncertain. In such conditions, collective rituals and shared narratives would serve as anchors. Monumental sites could function as memory centers, preserving identity amid change. The presence of such a site before agriculture raises another possibility. Rather than farming enabling monument building may have encouraged farming. The need to support repeated gatherings, sustained labor, and ritual continuity could have driven experimentation with cultivation. In this view, belief precedes economy. Culture shapes subsistence, not the other way around. This inversion disrupts deeply held assumptions. It suggests that the roots of civilization lie not in practicality, but in abstraction. In the desire to connect past and future. In the need to make sense of cycles larger than individual lives. Stone becomes the medium through which time is negotiated. The careful burial of the site reinforces this interpretation. It suggests awareness of transition. Perhaps the builders sensed that the conditions supporting their way of life were ending. Perhaps they chose to close the site as one closes a chapter, preserving it intact rather than letting it decay. The act resembles ritualized forgetting, a controlled loss rather than a collapse. What survives is a snapshot of capability that feels out of place because it doesn't fit the story of gradual ascent. It stands as evidence that complexity can appear early, disappear, and reappear in different forms. It challenges the notion that civilization has a single origin point. Instead, it points to pulses of organization shaped by environment, belief, and memory. The reluctance to fully integrate this site into broader historical narratives reflects more than academic caution. It reflects discomfort with nonlinearity. Accepting early complexity forces acceptance of later loss. It implies that what we call progress may include regression, not as failure, but as adaptation to changing realities. This place does not offer answers in the form of texts or inscriptions. It communicates through scale, effort, and silence. It reveals what humans were capable of before the story says they should have been. It leaves behind the impression of a society that invested in meaning deeply enough to carve it into stone, and then chose to bury it rather than forget it accidentally. What remains is not a missing link, but a misplaced one. A reminder that the past does not always unfold in the order assigned to it. That memory can precede survival strategy. that civilization may have begun not with fields, but with gathering around something unseen, something worth remembering, even as the world changed around it. The hill waited because it had to. Its builders understood time differently, and now that it has emerged, it unsettles the ground beneath every simple origin story, standing quietly as evidence that the first builders were not beginners at all. Not all technology leaves behind machines. Some of it dissolves the moment its carriers vanish, surviving only in effects, proportions, and results that no longer point clearly back to the means that produced them. This is the unease that settles in when examining traces of ancient capability that appear functional yet incomplete, like equations missing their operators. What remains suggests applied knowledge, but the process itself has slipped out of reach. Across multiple ancient sites, stone surfaces display patterns that imply more than brute force. Blocks resonate when struck, producing tones consistent across large structures. Chambers amplify sound in controlled ways, focusing vibration rather than dispersing it. These qualities are often attributed to coincidence or aesthetic intuition, yet their consistency across cultures hints at deliberate acoustic awareness. Sound, though invisible, behaves predictably. To shape space around it requires experimentation and memory. In some stone chambers, voices carry unnaturally, whispers traveling distances they should not. Low-frequency vibrations linger, affecting perception and inducing physical response. These effects are measurable today, yet their presence in ancient structures is rarely integrated into functional interpretation. Architecture is treated as visual and structural, not sensory. This omission obscures the possibility that sound played a role as significant as sight. Measurement offers another clue. Ancient sites often conform to units that repeat across regions, despite the absence of centralized authority. Distances align with ratios tied to astronomical cycles, not arbitrary convenience. Structures are scaled in ways that embed mathematics into form, reflecting relationships that extend beyond immediate utility. These measurements are not decorative. They function as interfaces between land, sky, and time. The recurrence of specific ratios suggests a shared conceptual framework, one that values harmony, proportion, and alignment with natural cycles. Such a framework does not emerge accidentally. It is taught, refined, and transmitted. The persistence of these ratios across disrupted timelines implies continuity of knowledge, even when material culture resets. Stoneworking itself preserves hints of technique. Certain cuts appear too smooth, too consistent to be the result of simple percussion alone. Abrasion, controlled pressure, and repeated motion leave signatures distinct from random impact. In some cases, surfaces curve with precision that implies guided shaping. These observations do not require exotic explanations. They require acknowledgement that toolkits were likely broader than those recovered. Materials matter. Copper, stone, wood, fiber, and water can combine in ways that leave no lasting trace. Tools made primarily of organic components would vanish, leaving behind only their effects on stone. What appears impossible becomes merely undocumented. The absence of surviving instruments says more about preservation bias than about capability. There is also the matter of energy. Ancient sites often sit atop geological features that interact with electromagnetic fields or water flow. These placements are sometimes dismissed as coincidental or symbolic. Yet the repetition of such locations suggests sensitivity to environmental forces. Awareness of these forces would not require modern theory, only observation and tradition. Knowledge does not need formalization to be effective. Ritual often acts as the vessel for technical knowledge in early societies. Procedures encoded as ceremony preserve precision without explanation. Movements, chants, and spatial arrangements repeat across generations, maintaining function while obscuring rationale. When the ritual fades, the knowledge collapses with it, leaving behind structures that no longer make sense in isolation. This pattern complicates interpretation. Modern analysis searches for explicit function, while ancient practice may have relied on implicit transmission. What looks like mysticism may have been method. What looks like symbolism may have been calibration. The line between ritual and technology blurs when both serve the same purpose. The reluctance to entertain these possibilities often stems from fear of misinterpretation. Yet, ignoring sensory and environmental dimensions creates its own distortion. It flattens ancient capability into something purely visual and mechanical, stripping away the experiential layers that likely mattered most to their creators. Comparative study reinforces this discomfort. Similar acoustic and proportional features appear in structures across continents, built by cultures with no known contact. This convergence suggests shared priorities rather than shared ancestry. Humans, faced with the same materials and senses, may arrive at similar solutions. Yet the precision with which these solutions are implemented suggests something more than trial and error. What emerges is a picture of technology as context-dependent. Not an inventory of devices, but a relationship with environment. Knowledge expressed through placement, orientation, and form. When that relationship breaks, the technology disappears even as the structure remains. This disappearance creates the illusion of primitivism. Without visible tools, the work appears miraculous or inexplicable. Yet the miracle lies not in lost machines, but in lost understanding. The ancients did not need to dominate nature to work with it. They needed patience, observation, and memory. The modern tendency to equate technology with complexity obscures this distinction. Simplicity can be sophisticated. Techniques optimized over generations may leave minimal trace. Efficiency does not always announce itself. It often hides in plain sight, embedded in choices that no longer seem obvious. There is humility in this realization. It suggests that technological advancement is not linear, and that progress can mean forgetting as much as inventing. That some forms of knowledge thrive only under specific cultural conditions and vanish when those conditions dissolve. The traces that remain do not point toward a singular lost device or secret. They point towards a mindset, one that integrated sound, space, measure, and environment into a coherent practice. One that did not separate the practical from the symbolic or the technical from the sacred. When such a mindset fades, what survives looks incomplete. Stones that sing without singers, chambers that resonate without ceremony, measurements that align without explanation. These remnants frustrate modern categorization because they were never meant to stand alone. The suggestion is not that ancient people possessed technology beyond comprehension, but that they understood their world differently. Their tools were extensions of observation rather than domination. Their methods were inseparable from belief, and when belief shifted, the methods dissolved. What remains is a landscape filled with silent instruments, tuned long ago for purposes that no longer have a voice. The evidence is not erased. It is simply waiting for interpretation that acknowledges absence as part of the record. Time, in the ancient world, was rarely imagined as a straight line. It moved in arcs, spirals, and returns, folding back on itself in rhythms that mirrored the sky and the seasons. This perspective shaped how early cultures understood collapse and renewal, not as endings, but as transitions woven into the structure of existence. When these ideas surface in surviving texts and symbols, they do not read like philosophy. They read like memory. Across disparate traditions, there is a recurring insistence that worlds end and begin again. Ages pass, not through gradual decay, but through decisive breaks. Fire, water, wind, and darkness mark the boundaries between epochs. These are not random elements. They reflect environmental forces capable of overwhelming civilization. The repetition of this framework across cultures suggests more than symbolic imagination. It suggests a shared expectation shaped by experience. Ancient cosmologies often describe time as segmented into great cycles, each with its own character and fate. Human history is nested within these cycles, subject to forces larger than any single society. The implication is humility. No matter how advanced a culture becomes, it remains temporary. Knowledge accumulates, peaks, and then thins as conditions change. What survives is not always what was best, but what was adaptable. This cyclical view contrasts sharply with modern narratives of progress. Linear time assumes improvement, accumulation, and permanence. Cyclical time assumes repetition, loss, and return. When early texts emphasize decline as an inevitable phase rather than a moral failure, they challenge the assumption that collapse is exceptional. Instead, collapse is expected. The language used to describe these cycles often blends observation with warning. Golden ages precede darker ones. Order gives way to confusion. Memory fades. Skills diminish. These are not portrayed as punishments alone, but as consequences of imbalance. When societies drift too far from alignment with natural rhythms, correction follows. This framing implies that collapse was observed, not imagined. Astronomical knowledge reinforces this perspective. Long-term cycles, such as precession, were recognized and embedded into myth and architecture. These cycles span thousands of years, far exceeding individual lifetimes. Their inclusion in cultural narratives suggests societies capable of thinking across deep time. Such thinking does not emerge from short-term success. It emerges from witnessing loss. The presence of reset narratives in cultures separated by vast distances suggests convergent understanding. Whether described as the turning of a wheel, the passing of an age, or the destruction of a world, the underlying message remains consistent. Civilization is fragile. Time is patient. The earth does not negotiate. What often goes unnoticed is how these cyclical models preserve knowledge through abstraction. By encoding history as pattern rather than sequence, they remain relevant even when specifics are forgotten. A story about a flood or a burning sky does not require dates to function. It requires recognition. When similar conditions arise, the story activates, offering guidance or caution. This abstraction allows memory to survive collapse. When institutions fail and records vanish, patterns endure. They are easier to transmit, harder to erase. Over time, the original events blur, but the structure remains intact. The cycle becomes a container for collective experience. Modern discomfort with these models stems from their implications. If collapse is natural, then no civilization is exempt. If time repeats, then advancement does not guarantee immunity. These ideas undermine narratives of exceptionalism and permanence. They suggest that what has happened before can happen again, regardless of technological sophistication. Geological evidence aligns uncomfortably well with this worldview. Earth's history is marked by abrupt transitions, mass extinctions, and rapid climate shifts. Stability is temporary. Change is inevitable. Ancient cultures may not have understood the mechanisms, but they recognized the pattern. Their cosmologies reflect an attempt to integrate human activity within these larger cycles. The idea of reset does not imply total erasure. Something always survives: seeds, stories, techniques, fragments of language. What resets is not humanity, but complexity. Systems collapse, not species. After each disruption, rebuilding begins from a reduced baseline, guided by what memory remains. This perspective reframes early civilization as part of a longer oscillation rather than a singular ascent. Peaks may have existed before the visible record, followed by declines that erased their material traces. What we call the dawn of civilization may be one of several recoveries, not the first awakening. The emphasis on cycles also explains the recurring theme of guardianship in ancient thought. Knowledge is portrayed as something that must be protected, hidden, or passed selectively. Initiation becomes a method of preservation, ensuring that understanding survives even if institutions do not. When collapse arrives, guardians carry fragments forward. Over time, as conditions stabilize, these fragments recombine. What emerges may resemble innovation, but it is guided by inherited patterns. This process creates the illusion of sudden advancement. In reality, it is remembering under new constraints. The language of cycles is often dismissed as fatalistic, yet it can also be pragmatic. Recognizing impermanence encourages resilience. It shifts focus from domination to balance, from accumulation to continuity. Ancient societies that survived repeated disruptions may have valued adaptability over expansion. The persistence of cyclical cosmology across millennia suggests it served a functional role. It prepared societies psychologically for loss. It framed catastrophe as transition rather than annihilation. This framing reduces despair and supports rebuilding. In this sense, myth becomes a technology of survival. The modern world, with its linear obsession, risks losing this perspective. Progress becomes an assumption rather than an achievement. Vulnerability is obscured by confidence. The lessons embedded in cyclical models are treated as archaic, stripped of relevance. Yet the patterns remain. Climate shifts, resources strain, systems destabilize. The ancient insistence on cycles begins to feel less symbolic and more observational. The past does not predict the future, but it reveals the shape of possibility. Within these cycles lies a quiet warning. Not dramatic, not accusatory. Simply a reminder that time does not owe continuity to anyone. That civilizations rise within constraints they do not control. That forgetting has consequences. The ancient world did not see itself as the center of history. It saw itself as a moment within a larger turning. That humility may be its most enduring legacy. And in the silence between cycles, memory waits, ready to surface again when conditions allow. The sky was never empty to the ancient mind. It was dense with movement, layered with meaning, and governed by rhythms that refused to bend to human urgency. While the ground shifted, flooded, burned, and fractured, the heavens remained steady enough to become a reference point for memory itself. In times when cities vanished and names were lost, the sky endured as a record that could not be erased. Long before formal science, careful watching shaped civilization. The motions of the sun, moon, and stars were not admired casually. They were tracked, compared, and remembered. This attention demanded patience across generations. One observer alone could note change, but only continuity could confirm it. The result was not speculation, but accumulated certainty. Patterns emerged because people stayed long enough to see them return. Stone circles, corridors, and markers across the ancient world demonstrate this commitment. They are aligned not approximately, but precisely, capturing moments when light enters darkness at exact times of year. These alignments are not decorative gestures. They encode calendrical knowledge essential for survival and coordination. To construct them requires confidence that future observers will stand where the builders once stood, continuing the count. What unsettles modern interpretation is the depth of time involved. Some alignments correspond not just to annual cycles, but to slow celestial shifts that unfold over centuries. The gradual change in the position of stars against the horizon, imperceptible in a single lifetime, becomes visible only through inheritance. Knowledge of this kind does not belong to isolated communities. It belongs to traditions. These traditions did not rely solely on written records. They embedded knowledge into landscape and ritual. The sky was memorized through repetition, reenacted through ceremony, and anchored through architecture. Each generation became both student and custodian, responsible not for innovation, but for accuracy. Change was tracked carefully, not imposed impulsively. The recognition of long astronomical cycles implies a worldview shaped by humility. Humans were not positioned at the center of time, but within it. Civilizations were understood as temporary expressions inside much larger rhythms. This perspective dissolves the illusion of permanence. When decline arrives, it is not shocking. It is expected. This expectation appears again and again in ancient symbolic systems. Ages are counted, not in years, but in qualities. Periods of order give way to periods of confusion. Light yields to darkness, then returns. These are not abstract metaphors. They mirror the slow turning of the heavens, translated into cultural language. Astronomical knowledge became a stabilizing force in unstable environments. After catastrophe, when landscapes were altered and familiar routes erased, the sky offered continuity. Survivors could reorient themselves not by landmarks, but by stars that had not moved. This reorientation was not merely practical, it was existential. It reaffirmed place within a universe that still obeyed rules. The people entrusted with this knowledge held a quiet form of authority. Their role was not domination, but calibration. They interpreted time, announced transitions, and maintained alignment between society and cycle. When their observations were trusted, coherence followed. When ignored or lost, disorder spread. Architecture reveals this relationship clearly. Many ancient structures prioritize alignment over convenience. They face directions that serve no defensive or economic purpose. Their orientation only makes sense when viewed through celestial context. Builders sacrificed ease for accuracy, embedding time into stone as a safeguard against forgetting. As centuries passed and disruptions accumulated, the technical understanding behind these alignments faded. What remained were myths, rituals, and symbols. Animals once associated with star groups became sacred figures. Seasonal rites replaced observational practice, meaning survived even as method dissolved. This transformation preserved memory at the cost of clarity. The fragmentation of astronomical knowledge mirrors the fragmentation of civilization itself. When continuity breaks, complexity thins. Long-term cycles collapse into shorter ones. Attention shifts from sky to ground, from patience to urgency. The heavens remain unchanged, but fewer people know how to listen. Modern narratives often frame ancient astronomy as primitive curiosity, a stepping stone toward science. This framing misunderstands its role. For early societies, celestial observation was not a precursor to something else. It was central. It governed time, legitimized authority, and anchored identity. Without it, society drifted. The persistence of these systems across continents suggests shared priorities rather than coincidence. Different cultures, facing similar vulnerabilities, turned upward for stability. They learned to measure what could not be controlled. In doing so, they created a record immune to most forms of destruction. This record outlived empires. Even when languages vanished, alignments remained. Even when cities collapsed, the sky continued its cycles, unchanged by human failure. Those who remembered how to read it could rebuild orientation without recovering the past entirely. The loss of this perspective carries consequences. When time is shortened, planning shrinks. When cycles are ignored, collapse feels sudden rather than inevitable. Ancient societies understood that survival depended not on resisting change, but on anticipating it. Watching the sky was preparation, not fascination. Fragments of this worldview survive in calendars, festivals, and inherited symbolism. Though stripped of explanation, they retain structure. They still mark thresholds. They still organize time. They are remnants of a discipline that once treated attention as a responsibility. The Watchers did not claim mastery over the heavens. They accepted limitation. They learned through observation rather than force. Their legacy is not a set of predictions, but a posture toward time itself, one that acknowledges repetition, loss, and return. The sky continues its motion without reference to human ambition. It turns slowly, patiently, indifferent to eras and names. What ancient cultures preserved was not dominance, but alignment. And alignment, once lost, must be remembered again the hard way. What remains in stone and story is not nostalgia. It is instruction, quiet and persistent. Time does not rush. It waits. And it rewards those who watch long enough to notice that nothing truly begins without having ended before. When civilizations break apart, knowledge does not disappear in a single moment. It contracts. It retreats inward, abandoning openness in favor of survival. What was once common understanding becomes restricted practice. What was once shared experience becomes layered instruction. This contraction is not accidental. It is a response to instability, a way to ensure that something endures when everything else fails. Across ancient societies, the emergence of custodial classes follows periods of disruption. These figures are not innovators, they are carriers. Their task is to hold fragments together long enough for continuity to resume. In doing so, they transform knowledge into structure. Procedures become rites. Observations become symbols. Memory is no longer free, it is protected by form. This transformation alters how truth survives. Knowledge that can be embedded in ritual, architecture, or myth travels further than knowledge that requires explanation. Precision is preserved through repetition rather than understanding. Movements are memorized, timings are fixed, words are recited. Meaning thins, but accuracy remains intact enough to function. This is not decay, it is compression. Priesthoods and initiatory orders emerge from this need. They limit access not out of malice, but necessity. In unstable conditions, widespread understanding risks misuse. Misuse leads to chaos. Restriction becomes stability. Over generations, restriction hardens into identity. Knowledge becomes inseparable from authority, and authority becomes inseparable from continuity. Writing, when it exists, reflects this imbalance. Early scripts often serve administrative, ceremonial, or cosmological purposes rather than open communication. Literacy confers power because it preserves orientation. Those who can read cycles, calculate time, or interpret signs become indispensable. Society organizes around them, trusting their alignment with forces beyond ordinary perception. Sacred spaces function as physical extensions of this guardianship. Their layouts guide movement and attention, reinforcing hierarchy through design. Certain paths are visible, others are concealed. Knowledge is spatially encoded, accessible only through progression. Even when texts vanish, the architecture remains as a silent instructor, preserving sequence without explanation. Over time, this system reshapes history itself. Guardians decide what is emphasized, what is softened, and what is allowed to fade. Not every omission is intentional. Selection is shaped by survival. What cannot be integrated into new frameworks is abandoned. What reinforces stability is preserved. The past becomes curated not for accuracy, but for coherence. This curation alters perception of origin. Survivors inherit fragments without context and mistake endurance for beginning. The earliest visible layer becomes the foundation, even if it rests on something older and unseen. Knowledge that survived collapse is treated as invention rather than residue. Memory becomes compressed into myth, and myth is mistaken for imagination. As institutions solidify, preservation turns rigid. What was once adaptable becomes doctrine. Symbol replaces observation. Authority resists revision because revision threatens legitimacy. The very structures that once protected continuity now obstruct it. When conditions change again, these rigid systems fracture under their own weight. Collapse follows familiar patterns. Centralized knowledge falls fastest. Libraries burn, archives vanish, specialists scatter or disappear, yet fragments survive in unexpected places: songs, calendars, rituals, and inherited gestures whose purpose is no longer understood. These fragments carry alignment without explanation, like tools without instructions. New custodians arise from these remnants. They reinterpret fragments through contemporary needs, assigning new meanings to old forms. The cycle begins again. Knowledge survives, but altered. Each iteration drifts further from origin, even as it claims fidelity. Continuity is preserved at the cost of clarity. This process explains why history feels incomplete. Gaps are not empty by chance. They mark transitions where knowledge could not survive in its original form. What remains is what could adapt to new power structures, new environments, and new fears. The rest dissolves, leaving absence mistaken for ignorance. The guardianship model leaves a lasting imprint on how societies understand truth. Knowledge becomes something granted rather than discovered. Authority replaces inquiry. Stability becomes more valuable than accuracy. Over time, this produces confidence built on fragments, reinforced by repetition rather than understanding. Modern systems differ in appearance, but not in impulse. Archives, institutions, and disciplines continue to filter memory through frameworks that prioritize coherence. Disruption is resisted. Anomalies are isolated. What does not fit is deferred rather than integrated. The instinct to protect narrative remains stronger than the impulse to revise it. Understanding this pattern does not require suspicion. It requires recognition of constraint. Knowledge has always been shaped by the conditions under which it survives. Preservation is never neutral. It selects, compresses, and reshapes. What reaches the present is not what was most accurate, but what was most durable. This durability creates illusion. The surviving narrative feels complete because it endured. Its authority comes from survival rather than verification. Questioning it feels destabilizing, not because it is false, but because it has become foundational. Foundations resist excavation. The ancient guardians understood something often forgotten. Memory is vulnerable. Power distorts. Continuity demands compromise. Their systems were attempts to navigate these forces, not to transcend them. They preserved enough to allow rebuilding, but not enough to prevent repetition. What they left behind is not a secret code, but a warning embedded in structure. Knowledge that cannot adapt becomes fragile. Knowledge that cannot be shared becomes distorted. Knowledge that becomes authority invites collapse. History does not erase truth deliberately. It filters it through survival. What remains is shaped by fear, necessity, and hope. To read the past clearly requires attention not only to what is present, but to why it endured while so much else vanished. The silence in history is not empty. It is the space where knowledge once lived, compressed, guarded, and eventually transformed beyond recognition. And within that silence lies the pattern of loss that repeats, quietly, across every civilization that mistakes endurance for completeness. History often presents itself as a clean inheritance, passed down intact from one age to the next. Yet beneath that appearance lies a quieter process, one that shapes memory not through destruction alone, but through careful omission. What survives is not simply what endured time, but what was allowed to endure power. Erasure, in this sense, is not a moment, it is a method. When new orders rise from the remnants of old ones, they inherit more than land and labor. They inherit unresolved pasts. Those pasts contain ideas, practices, and memories that may no longer serve the present structure. Some are incompatible with new authority. Others threaten coherence by revealing how fragile continuity truly is. The response is rarely open confrontation. It is absorption, redirection, and silence. Texts offer the clearest example. The survival of ancient writings depends less on their accuracy than on their usefulness. Copying is labor. Labor follows priority. What aligns with prevailing frameworks is preserved, annotated, and taught. What complicates those frameworks is set aside. Over generations, the difference between what was written and what was remembered widens until absence feels natural. This process reshapes meaning rather than eliminating it outright. Earlier systems of understanding are often folded into newer ones, stripped of technical depth and reinterpreted symbolically. Observations of natural cycles become moral allegories. Practical knowledge becomes sacred narrative. The structure remains familiar, but its function shifts. The past is not denied. It is reframed. Architecture participates in this reframing. Sacred sites are rarely abandoned entirely. They are reused, expanded, or renamed. Foundations remain because they are effective. Alignments persist because they still resonate with land and sky. New symbols are layered over old ones, claiming continuity while quietly severing lineage. Over time, the original intent becomes inaccessible without seeming lost. Language accelerates this transformation. Words that once carried precise meanings drift toward metaphor. Metaphor becomes doctrine. Doctrine resists reinterpretation. Eventually, the original reference disappears, leaving behind a term that feels ancient yet unmoored. The sound survives. The sense does not. Erasure thrives in stability. When societies fear fragmentation, they favor simplified narratives. Complexity becomes suspect. Contradiction becomes dangerous. Institutions form to manage memory, and management requires boundaries. What lies outside those boundaries is not attacked. It is ignored. Silence proves more durable than fire. The destruction of knowledge repositories, often remembered as dramatic loss, usually marks the end rather than the beginning of erasure. By the time texts burn, many have already stopped being copied. By the time sites are dismantled, their meanings have already shifted. Physical destruction finalizes what cultural neglect began. What survives is coherence. A streamlined past emerges, one that supports identity and authority. This past feels inevitable because alternatives have vanished. The gaps are invisible. Without competing narratives, certainty hardens. History becomes less an inquiry and more an affirmation. Anomalies disrupt this affirmation. Artifacts, alignments, and records that resist categorization introduce discomfort. Their existence is acknowledged, but their implications are minimized. Specialized language contains them. Context is narrowed. Over time, attention moves elsewhere. The anomaly remains, but its voice fades. This pattern does not require intent. It arises from alignment of incentives. Stability rewards clarity. Authority rewards predictability. Institutions reward consensus. The cumulative effect is a historical record shaped by endurance rather than completeness. What lasted feels true. What vanished feels irrelevant. The psychological impact is profound. When the past is simplified, the present inherits a distorted sense of resilience. Collapse feels impossible. Regression feels unthinkable. Progress becomes assumed. The lessons embedded in failure are stripped away, leaving confidence without caution. Modern scholarship operates within this inherited framework. Questions are shaped by categories formed long before. Evidence that challenges foundational assumptions faces resistance not because it lacks substance, but because it destabilizes coherence. Revision threatens more than knowledge. It threatens identity. Yet traces of what was lost persist. They appear in misalignments between story and structure, in symbols that feel heavier than their explanations, in practices whose origins are no longer discussed. These traces are often dismissed as coincidence or decoration, but repetition weakens coincidence. Patterns accumulate quietly. Erasure leaves no monument. It leaves smoothness. It leaves a past easy to accept and difficult to question. Its success lies in making loss feel like order. What is missing cannot be missed because nothing points to it anymore. Understanding this process reframes silence as evidence. Absence becomes informative. The lack of continuity signals not ignorance, but interruption. What was not preserved may have mattered enough to be inconvenient. The past that reaches the present is not neutral. It is the result of centuries of filtering under pressure. What endured did so because it could be carried through instability without threatening new frameworks. What disappeared may have demanded more honesty than systems could afford. Acknowledging this does not dismantle history. It deepens it. Certainty becomes provisional. Foundations invite examination. The past reveals itself not as a finished account, but as a layered construct shaped by survival, fear, and adaptation. Erasure does not eliminate influence. What is removed continues to shape what remains by defining its limits. Silence constrains interpretation. Absence narrows imagination. History governs the present not only through what it remembers, but through what it chose to forget. In that forgetting lies a pattern older than any institution. Knowledge rises, condenses, and slips from view, not because it was weak, but because it did not fit the shape required to endure. And that shape, repeated across civilizations, continues to decide what the future is allowed to remember. When belief systems evolve into governing structures, their influence extends far beyond ritual or morality. They begin to shape how time itself is understood. History, once experienced as layered and contingent, becomes ordered, trimmed, and aligned with doctrine. This transformation does not require deception. It emerges from the need to stabilize meaning in a world that repeatedly proves unstable. Early spiritual frameworks were inseparable from observation. They responded to seasons, celestial cycles, fertility, disaster, and recovery. Knowledge moved freely between the practical and the symbolic. A flood was both water and warning. A star was both light and calendar. There was little separation between how the world functioned and how it was understood. Meaning followed experience. As societies expanded, this fluidity became difficult to manage. Larger populations required consistent narratives. Authority required legitimacy that extended backward in time. Belief systems adapted by formalizing. What had once been interpretive became prescriptive. Memory shifted from collective experience to sanctioned account. The past was no longer something remembered together. It became something defined. This is where religion assumes the role of editor. Not creator, not destroyer, but curator. Older traditions are not rejected outright. They are reorganized. Their symbols are retained because they resonate. Their structures persist because they work. But their interpretations are redirected to fit emerging hierarchies. Continuity is preserved, while autonomy is removed. Cycles become especially vulnerable under this process. Earlier cultures often understood time as recursive, shaped by rise and decline, creation and collapse. These models reflected environmental reality. Stability was temporary. Loss was expected. Renewal followed disruption. As religious authorities centralized, cyclical time gave way to linear progression. One origin, one truth, one end. This framework simplified history into a moral sequence rather than a pattern. Linear time strengthens authority. It establishes fixed beginnings that cannot be questioned and destinations that cannot be avoided. It discourages comparison with prior ages. It narrows interpretation. What falls outside the sanctioned arc becomes irrelevant or dangerous. Complexity dissolves into obedience. Sacred texts crystallize this process. Canon formation is not merely spiritual selection, it is historical editing. Texts that align with doctrine are preserved, copied, and taught. Others are neglected until they disappear. Over centuries, survival becomes indistinguishable from truth. Absence is mistaken for error. What remains defines reality. Education reinforces this framework. Religious institutions often become primary centers of learning, shaping not only belief but knowledge itself. Inquiry is permitted within boundaries. Observation is filtered through interpretation. When the world contradicts doctrine, doctrine absorbs or reframes the contradiction. The narrative remains intact. The absorption of earlier knowledge often preserves surface while dissolving depth. Astronomical awareness becomes liturgical calendar. Mathematical relationships become sacred proportions. Agricultural cycles become holy observances. These transformations protect continuity while limiting independent understanding. Knowledge survives as ritual rather than method. Sacred architecture reveals this inheritance clearly. Many religious structures stand on sites far older than the belief systems that claim them. Their orientations align with land and sky in ways that predate current doctrine. These alignments persist because they function, even when their original rationale is forgotten. New meaning is layered over old structure. The past is claimed without being named. Over time, this layering creates the illusion of singular origin. What was inherited feels original because its predecessors are no longer visible. Earlier systems vanish not through destruction, but through anonymity. Without reference, continuity collapses into apparent beginning. Authority consolidates around this edited past. To challenge the narrative is to challenge legitimacy. Inquiry becomes risk. Curiosity becomes threat. History hardens into foundation rather than field of study. Revision feels destabilizing because identity depends on permanence. The consequences extend beyond belief. When doctrine edits history, innovation becomes constrained. Knowledge that contradicts sanctioned understanding struggles to emerge. Observation yields to interpretation. Meaning overrides mechanism. Over generations, the gap between reality and narrative widens, even as confidence grows. Moments of reform expose this tension. When evidence accumulates that cannot be absorbed, institutions resist not out of ignorance but out of preservation. Revision requires reopening the past. Reopening the past threatens coherence. Delay becomes defense. The modern distinction between religion and science often obscures their shared history. Early religious systems preserved knowledge through ritual when no other means existed. Their editorial role began as conservation. Over time, conservation hardened into control. The function shifted, but the structure remained. This evolution explains why certain historical inquiries feel culturally sensitive. They do not merely question facts. They question inheritance. When belief systems define history, revising the past feels like erasing identity. Resistance becomes emotional, not analytical. Even after formal authority weakens, the editorial legacy persists. Secular narratives often retain linear timelines and origin stories shaped by religious frameworks, stripped of theology but not structure. The editor disappears. The edit endures. What is lost in this process is not belief, but adaptability. Early systems adjusted to observation and environment. Later systems prioritized certainty. Certainty reduced resilience. When conditions changed, rigid narratives struggled to respond. The editorial role of religion does not require malicious intent. It requires commitment to order. In unstable worlds, order sustains communities. But order also narrows memory. What cannot be ordered is excluded. Over centuries, exclusion becomes silence. Traces of earlier frameworks remain visible in inconsistencies. Rituals whose origins are no longer discussed. Symbols that feel older than their explanations. Stories that resist doctrinal alignment. These are not mistakes. They are seams where older layers press through. Understanding religion as history's editor reframes conflict between belief and evidence. It is not a struggle between truth and falsehood. It is a tension between stability and revision. Both serve survival, but at different costs. The past that survives this process feels authoritative, yet incomplete. It speaks confidently about origins while remaining silent about transitions. It offers meaning without context. Its endurance reflects usefulness rather than totality. Recognizing this does not diminish faith. It clarifies function. Religion preserved memory when little else could. It also shaped that memory to endure under pressure. Preservation and distortion emerge from the same impulse. What remains now is a layered inheritance. Beneath doctrine lie fragments of older understanding, still embedded in calendar, architecture, and symbol. They are not hidden deliberately. They are simply no longer explained. The editor has stepped back, but the margins remain. And within those margins, history continues to press forward, shaped as much by what was refined away as by what was allowed to remain. A certain tension emerges whenever modern thinking brushes against the deeper layers of human time. It is not rejection, and it is not disbelief. It is restraint, a subtle tightening around the edges of interpretation, as though history itself must be kept within a manageable distance. The farther complexity is pushed into the past, the more fragile the present begins to feel. Modern civilization is anchored to the idea of forward motion. Advancement is framed as accumulation, improvement as inevitability. This assumption shapes how the past is arranged. Timelines are streamlined, origins simplified, and interruptions minimized. The story must move upward because the present depends on believing that it has arrived somewhere permanent. Within this framework, deep antiquity becomes problematic. If sophisticated knowledge, organization, or symbolic coherence existed far earlier than expected, then modernity loses its exclusivity. Innovation begins to resemble rediscovery. Progress begins to look cyclical. The present becomes less an endpoint and more a phase. This discomfort is rarely stated openly. It appears instead as methodological caution, academic conservatism, or cultural indifference. Evidence is acknowledged but compartmentalized. Discoveries that complicate the standard narrative are treated as exceptions rather than signals. The larger structure remains untouched. Education reinforces this pattern. Historical instruction favors clarity over depth. Long stretches of time are compressed into transitional labels. Collapse is framed as deviation rather than recurrence. The result is a past that feels orderly, predictable, and safely distant from the present. Such framing provides psychological reassurance. A linear past implies a linear future. If civilization has always advanced, then decline feels unlikely. Vulnerability becomes abstract. Risk becomes theoretical. The past is allowed to fail only so that the present may feel secure. Yet evidence continues to surface that resists this comfort. Early architectural precision, sudden appearances of complex systems, shared symbolic frameworks across distant cultures. Each instance suggests that human capability has not moved in a single direction. It has surged, stabilized, fractured, and reassembled. The response to these signals is often linguistic rather than analytical. Terms like anomalous, speculative, or controversial are deployed to contain their impact. These labels do not refute evidence, they delay its integration. Over time, delay becomes dismissal. This process is not driven by ignorance, it is driven by incentive. Academic frameworks reward continuity, funding follows consensus, careers depend on stability. Revising foundational assumptions introduces uncertainty, and uncertainty spreads slowly in structured systems. There is also a cultural narrative at stake. Modern identity is built in contrast to the ancient. Rationality replaces myth. Technology replaces ritual. Control replaces reverence. When ancient societies appear observant, precise, or deeply integrated with natural cycles, this contrast weakens. The boundary blurs. Media reinforces this separation by aestheticizing the past. Ancient cultures are framed as mysterious rather than knowledgeable, spiritual rather than analytical. Mystery invites fascination without comparison. Understanding invites re-evaluation. The deeper resistance, however, lies beneath image and narrative. It lies in the fear of fragility. Deep history reveals how easily systems dissolve, how quickly knowledge thins when continuity breaks, how advanced societies can regress without disappearing entirely. This awareness undermines confidence in permanence. Modern systems invest heavily in endurance. Digital archives, global infrastructure, and distributed networks are designed to outlast disruption. The suggestion that earlier civilizations may have felt similar assurance only to lose it introduces doubt. The past becomes a warning rather than a prelude. Scientific disciplines themselves reflect this tension. While geology and cosmology accept deep time without hesitation, human history remains constrained. Rocks may be ancient, stars may be billions of years old. Civilization, however, must remain recent, orderly, and progressive. This exception reveals an unspoken hierarchy. Human systems are treated as exempt from the patterns that govern everything else. Collapse applies to ecosystems, not societies. Cycles apply to nature, not culture. This separation preserves comfort but resists evidence. Environmental records do not respect this boundary. Climate shifts reshape societies. Resource changes alter behavior. Migration, adaptation, and loss repeat across time. The same forces that shape landscapes shape history, only faster and more visibly. The reluctance to fully engage with deep antiquity is therefore not intellectual alone. It is existential. Accepting that civilization has risen and fallen before invites responsibility. It implies that knowledge can be lost, that complexity can unravel, that survival does not guarantee continuity. This responsibility is heavy. It demands humility rather than celebration, caution rather than confidence. The modern world, built on acceleration, resists such slowing. As a result, silence becomes a strategy. Not denial, but omission. The deeper past remains present in fragments, acknowledged without emphasis. Curiosity narrows not because questions are forbidden, but because they are unsupported. Public understanding follows these cues. What institutions emphasize feels important. What they minimize feels fringe. Over time, the unfamiliar past becomes less explored, not because it lacks evidence, but because it lacks permission. There is irony here. Modern culture values inquiry, yet often avoids the implications of its own discoveries. Advanced technology reveals complexity in the ancient world, but interpretation retreats to preserve hierarchy. Tools expand, narratives contract. This tension shapes how the future is imagined. If the past is shallow, the future feels controllable. If the past is deep and cyclical, the future feels contingent. The difference between these visions is not academic. It shapes policy, planning, and collective expectation. Deep antiquity does not threaten modern achievement. It contextualizes it. Recognizing earlier peaks of organization does not diminish the present. It reframes it as part of a longer pattern of resilience and loss. The discomfort surrounding this realization is understandable. It challenges the comfort of uniqueness. It replaces certainty with perspective. But perspective is not erosion. It is grounding. The past does not ask for belief. It asks for attention. Its complexity does not undermine progress. It cautions it. It reminds civilization that endurance is earned, not guaranteed. As evidence continues to accumulate, compression becomes harder to maintain. Patterns repeat. Alignments persist. Confidence softens. The depth presses closer. The resistance felt around deep antiquity reveals less about ancient humanity than about modern fear. Fear of fragility. Fear of repetition. Fear of recognizing that progress, without memory, is incomplete. The depth is already present beneath the surface narrative. It does not demand acceptance. It simply remains, exerting pressure, waiting for the moment when curiosity outweighs comfort, and history is allowed to extend to the length it has always carried. There is a point at which the present stops feeling permanent and starts feeling provisional. It happens quietly, not through catastrophe, but through perspective. When the long arc of human time is allowed to curve instead of stretch forward in a straight line, civilization begins to resemble a recurring condition rather than a final achievement. Stability appears not as an end point, but as a temporary arrangement negotiated with forces that never stop moving. Across history, societies expand by mastering concentration. Food systems intensify. Knowledge narrows into expertise. Authority centralizes to manage scale. These processes generate remarkable growth. Cities rise. Trade networks widen. Cultural production flourishes. The system becomes efficient, coordinated, and confident. At the same time, it becomes sensitive. Every gain in efficiency removes a layer of redundancy. Every specialization creates dependency. What looks like strength is often precision balanced on narrow tolerance. Strain accumulates gradually. Environmental variability tests food supply. Resource extraction accelerates beyond renewal. Inequality widens social distance. Administrative systems grow heavy with complexity. None of these pressures alone cause collapse. Together, they thin adaptability. The system becomes less capable of absorbing shock. When disruption finally breaks through, it feels sudden only because it was normalized for too long. Material evidence preserves this rhythm without commentary. Archaeological layers show dense occupation followed by thinning. Monumental construction halts. Writing becomes simpler or disappears. Trade contracts. Cultural output narrows. These shifts are often framed as decline, but decline implies loss without function. What appears instead is adjustment. Civilization releases what it can no longer sustain. The societies that follow are not blank slates. They are shaped by what survived stress. Survivors carry forward fragments that require less infrastructure, tools that can be repaired locally, stories that compress instruction into narrative, symbols that preserve identity without explanation. Over generations, these fragments recombine, creating the impression of innovation while carrying the imprint of loss. This recurring pattern challenges the assumption that progress is cumulative. Advancement expands capability, but also multiplies vulnerability. Technologies that enable growth deepen dependence. Systems optimized for efficiency perform poorly under variability. What builds complexity often undermines resilience. Modern civilization fits this structure with uncomfortable precision. Its technological reach is unprecedented. Its interdependence is extreme. Energy systems span continents. Supply chains cross oceans. Information moves instantly, yet relies on fragile networks to exist at all. Efficiency has been refined relentlessly. Resilience has not always followed at the same pace. Confidence in immunity rests on novelty, new science, new governance, new awareness. Every era approaching its peak has believed the same. Each assumed its solutions had transcended earlier limits. History suggests otherwise. Novelty alters form, not pattern. Ancient societies also believed in permanence. They aligned architecture with eternity. They traced ancestry back into sacred time. Their confidence was sincere. It did not protect them. Certainty delayed response. Stability dulled sensitivity to change. What distinguishes societies that persist longer is not dominance, but proportion. They resist overextension. They preserve redundancy. They distribute knowledge instead of concentrating it. They allow flexibility to coexist with structure. These traits slow expansion, but they soften contraction. Collapse, understood this way, is not moral failure. It is systemic correction. When complexity exceeds environmental support, systems simplify. When specialization outpaces maintenance, roles merge. The reset is mechanical, not ideological. The system reverts to what can be carried forward. This perspective reframes the present. Modern civilization is not exempt from pattern. It participates in it. Its scale amplifies both capacity and fragility. The forces that shaped earlier rises and contractions remain active, now accelerated by connectivity. Climate variability, resource pressure, and social fragmentation recur throughout history. They are constants, not surprises. What changes is response. Tools expand options, but they do not remove limits. Limits shift into new domains, often less visible until stressed. The most dangerous condition is denial. When collapse is framed as impossible, preparation feels unnecessary. When it is understood as pattern, resilience becomes intentional. Memory becomes infrastructure. Awareness becomes defense. The long view transforms urgency into responsibility. If civilizations repeatedly rise and thin, then the present is neither doomed nor guaranteed. Its endurance depends on decisions made, while confidence still dominates perception. Those decisions include how knowledge is preserved. Centralized systems store vast detail but lose it rapidly under disruption. Distributed systems preserve less precision but endure longer. History favors distribution for survival, even when centralization excels during expansion. They also include how success is measured. Growth without balance accelerates fragility. Stability without adaptability hardens into rigidity. Endurance emerges from tension between expansion and restraint, not from supremacy of either. Ancient warnings encoded in story and structure often emphasize balance, not conquest, not accumulation. Balance with forces larger than any society. These warnings were not abstractions. They were survival lessons learned repeatedly and preserved imperfectly. Modern culture often resists this framing. Balance feels like limitation. Limitation feels like failure. Yet historical pattern suggests the opposite. Unchecked expansion is the most reliable precursor to contraction. Understanding civilization as cyclical does not drain meaning from achievement. It intensifies it. Achievements matter because they are temporary. Knowledge matters because it can vanish. Preservation becomes active practice rather than assumption. The present occupies a familiar position within this rhythm. Extraordinary capability paired with familiar risk. Global systems amplify success and failure simultaneously. Solutions spread rapidly. So do disruptions. The scale is unprecedented. The structure is not. Recognizing this does not demand fear. It demands clarity. The willingness to see the present as a phase shaped by inheritance and shaping inheritance in return. To accept that what is built today becomes the residue tomorrow. Civilizations leave fragments because fragments endure stress better than systems. The form those fragments take depends on priorities set during confidence, not crisis. What is valued now determines what remains later. History shows that something always survives. Language adapts, symbols persist, practices simplify. Memory continues unevenly. What endures is rarely what was most advanced. It is what was most adaptable. The present will become a layer. Its future interpretation will depend less on what it achieved than on what it preserved in usable form. Whether understanding was shared or hoarded. Whether continuity was planned for or assumed. Civilization does not escape cycles by denying them. It navigates them by acknowledging gravity. The tide turns regardless. Awareness determines whether the shoreline erodes or reshapes. The pattern is not a sentence. It is context. Within it lies agency, not over time itself, but over how consciously the present participates in a rhythm older than any single society, and patient enough to wait for recognition. At a certain point, the remnants of earlier worlds stop feeling distant and begin to feel immediate, not because they announce themselves, but because they align. Fragments scattered across time start to echo one another with increasing clarity. The same structural choices recur. The same pressures surface. The same adaptations appear, not as imitation, but as convergence. The past does not return as spectacle, it returns as pattern. These patterns are not preserved intentionally. They persist because they are durable responses to recurring conditions. When societies grow dense and interconnected, they tend toward compression. Systems streamline, margins are trimmed, efficiency becomes virtue. The result is speed and reach, paired with sensitivity. Small disturbances ripple outward, amplified by interdependence. What feels like mastery often masks fragility. In earlier civilizations, this compression was visible in the late phases of growth. Administrative systems multiplied. Specialization deepened. Infrastructure grew intricate. Cultural output reached refinement. At the same time, tolerance for variability declined. When stress arrived, it moved quickly through tightly coupled systems. The record preserves this sequence repeatedly, not as moral lesson, but as mechanical outcome. Narratives change alongside structure. As complexity peaks, explanations harden. Identity solidifies around success. Stories that once accommodated revision become fixed. Authority draws strength from continuity rather than responsiveness. This rigidity does not cause collapse by itself. It prevents adjustment when conditions shift. Adaptation slows as certainty increases. The substitution of appearance for function marks another recurring signal. Maintenance gives way to display. Ceremony replaces repair. Symbols are emphasized as systems strain beneath them. This shift preserves the feeling of continuity while allowing degradation to proceed unnoticed. It is not deception. It is distraction shaped by momentum. Environmental response follows a similar course. Under pressure, societies intensify extraction. They push harder against limits rather than recalibrating. Short-term stability is prioritized over long-term balance. This strategy produces temporary relief and deeper dependency. The pattern is ancient. The tempo varies. Knowledge behavior changes in predictable ways. Late-stage systems centralize information. Archives expand. Expertise narrows. Understanding becomes siloed. The system accumulates detail while losing synthesis. When disruption arrives, knowledge exists but cannot mobilize across boundaries fast enough. Abundance collapses into silence. These signals are not warnings delivered from beyond history. They are feedback embedded in process. They appear whenever growth outruns adaptability, whenever confidence replaces curiosity, whenever memory becomes archive rather than practice. What makes these signals difficult to ignore is their familiarity. They do not belong exclusively to antiquity. They resonate with the present because they arise from structure, not era. The same mechanics operate under different technologies. The names change, the shapes persist. The past communicates most clearly through what survives. After contraction, fragments remain. Language simplifies. Symbols persist. Practices adapt. Knowledge thins without vanishing. What endures is rarely what was most advanced. It is what was most portable, light enough to travel, flexible enough to recombine. This survival bias carries instruction without instruction. Longevity favors what can compress and reassemble. Heavy systems fracture. Distributed practices endure. The record does not argue this point. It demonstrates it. Another persistent signal lies in repetition without recognition. Societies reconstruct similar arrangements because they face similar pressures. Without integrated memory, outcomes converge. The fragments that survive collapse worn, but without context. Over time, warning becomes story. Story becomes ornament. Ornament repeats under new conditions, stripped of consequence. Absence speaks as clearly as survival. Gaps in the record align with periods of stress. Silence marks transition. Where continuity breaks, explanation thins. These gaps are not empty. They are scars left by systems that failed faster than memory could carry them forward. Modern confidence often treats these absences as ignorance, yet absence itself indicates loss. What vanished did so because it could not endure the conditions that followed. The lesson lies not in what was lost, but in why it could not survive. Taken together, these signals suggest that history does not conceal its mechanics. They are visible across disciplines and eras. The difficulty lies not in detection, but in acceptance. Acceptance requires releasing the belief in exemption. That novelty dissolves limits, that awareness alone prevents outcome. The record suggests restraint matters as much as insight. The past does not offer prophecy. It offers proportion. It places the present within a rhythm larger than ambition. It reframes resilience as capacity to absorb change without losing continuity. Not permanence, but persistence. As systems approach thresholds, sensitivity increases, feedback loops tighten, small perturbations produce larger effects, outcomes converge faster. This is not acceleration of history, but reduction of margin. The signs feel louder because tolerance has narrowed. History does not speak in sentences. It speaks in results. Cities abandoned, networks simplified, knowledge redistributed, symbols reused. These results recur because the conditions recur. The pattern is patient and indifferent to interpretation. What distinguishes the present is not uniqueness of pressure, but breadth of awareness. Evidence accumulates across continents and millennia. Tools enable synthesis at scale. Patterns that were once isolated now appear contiguous. The signals are no longer rare. They are concurrent. Recognition alone does not ensure adjustment. Adjustment requires choices made before stress overwhelms perception. Resilience is constructed during confidence, not improvised during crisis. What is valued in times of abundance determines what remains after contraction. The past cannot intervene, it can only reflect. The reflection is steady, stripped of reassurance. It does not accuse, it does not console. It shows outcomes repeating under similar structures. The fragments left by earlier worlds continue to surface because they are the most durable forms of memory. They do not point backward in nostalgia. They orient outward, toward conditions that allow continuity to persist through change. The signals have always been present: compression, rigidity, substitution, intensification. Fragment survival, silence after abundance. These are not omens, they are mechanics. The task is not to fear them, nor to deny them, but to read them with clarity. Literacy in pattern matters more than reverence for detail. The past does not demand belief. It demands recognition of structure. What remains undecided is not whether the signals exist, it is how they will be interpreted, as noise to be filtered or as structure to be addressed. History offers no assurance either way. The past has already spoken through repetition. It continues to speak through alignment. Its message is not dramatic. It is persistent. And persistence, once noticed, reshapes how the present understands itself within a rhythm that never stopped moving. As this long journey reaches its quiet end, the idea of numbering civilizations settles into something heavier than curiosity. To speak of a seventh is not to claim advancement or destiny. It is to acknowledge recurrence. It is to accept that civilization is not a straight inheritance, but a repeating condition, assembled, stressed, thinned, and assembled again from what remains. What endures through this pattern is not empire, not technology, not certainty. What endures is humanity itself, carrying fragments forward each time the structure around it fails. The past, when viewed without urgency, does not describe a single rise from darkness. It describes multiple recoveries, each shaped by memory that survived unevenly. Earlier civilizations were not naive. They observed the world closely. They built with intention. They aligned stone, sky, and season with care. Their collapse did not come from ignorance, but from imbalance. Complexity outran adaptability. Systems became too precise to bend. When pressure arrived, correction followed. The traces left behind were never meant as warnings. They are residues of survival. Stone foundations reused by later cultures. Myths that compress catastrophe into story. measurements preserved without explanation. These fragments are not evidence of superiority or failure. They are evidence of continuity struggling through disruption. Erasure, when examined closely, reveals itself as structural rather than malicious. Knowledge disappears not because it is hunted down, but because it cannot travel in its original form. What depends on uninterrupted systems dissolves first. What survives is what can be carried by people, remembered through practice, or embedded into simple, repeatable forms. The present inherits this reality intact. Modern civilization excels at accumulation. Data expands faster than comprehension. Infrastructure stretches across continents. Systems interlock with unprecedented precision. These achievements are genuine. They also narrow margin. When everything depends on everything else, disturbance multiplies. What distinguishes this moment from earlier ones is not exemption from pattern, but awareness of it. The fragments that once lay scattered across disciplines now align. Geological disruption aligns with cultural collapse. Myth aligns with climate record. Technological fragility mirrors ancient overextension. The pattern has become legible. Legibility does not guarantee response. History suggests that recognition often arrives when momentum is hardest to slow. Confidence delays recalibration. Efficiency resists redundancy. The belief in permanence dulls sensitivity to change. This belief has appeared before, often just before systems thinned. The deeper lesson of repeated collapse is not fear. It is proportion. Complexity demands maintenance. Maintenance demands humility. Humility requires acknowledgement of limits. Where limits are denied, systems overshoot. Where overshoot accumulates, correction follows without negotiation. To be one civilization among many reframes responsibility. The present does not stand above the past, it stands within it. Inheriting fragments carries obligation to preserve without distortion, to remember without simplifying, to carry understanding forward in forms that survive disruption. Earlier societies preserved what they could. They embedded knowledge in ritual, architecture, and story, because those forms endured longer than institutions. Much was still lost. What remained was enough to begin again, but not enough to prevent repetition. Modern civilization faces the same challenge with different tools. Digital memory expands reach, but concentrates vulnerability. Centralized archives grow vast, but fracture quickly under stress. What survives afterward will be whatever was already internalized, simplified, and practiced. Medium does not change pattern. Continuity, then, becomes practical rather than philosophical. What knowledge exists in people rather than systems? What skills can be rebuilt locally? What understanding survives when speed, scale, and power are stripped away? The long record suggests that endurance favors what is adaptable and widely shared. Heavy systems fracture. Dense networks snap. What travels forward are fragments capable of recombination. Language, rhythm, proportion, story, technique reduced to essence. This does not diminish modern achievement. It clarifies its fragility. Achievements matter precisely because they are temporary. Knowledge matters because it can vanish. Preservation becomes an active responsibility rather than an assumed outcome. Collapse, viewed through this lens, is not annihilation. It is transition. Something always follows. What differs is how much understanding crosses the threshold intact. That difference determines whether recovery resembles remembering or rediscovery. If this configuration is the seventh, it will not be the last. The number carries no protection. What carries forward is attentiveness, attention to balance, to limits, to the quiet labor of maintenance that rarely announces itself as progress. Civilizations do not disappear because they are punished. They dissolve because they exceed their own conditions. The earth does not negotiate. Systems adjust. Memory survives unevenly. The rhythm continues. The evidence once described as erased now appears simply unintegrated. It waited not because it was hidden, but because alignment was required to read it. That alignment has emerged gradually through accumulation rather than revelation. What remains undecided is not whether history repeats, but whether repetition must remain blind. Awareness does not stop cycles, but it can soften transitions. It can widen margin. It can preserve continuity through change rather than after collapse. The long arc does not promise permanence, it offers orientation. Civilization persists not by escaping pattern, but by recognizing it early enough to adjust posture, loosening rigidity, valuing resilience over spectacle. What the past leaves behind is not instruction carved in certainty. It leaves fragments arranged in a way that becomes legible only when viewed together. Those fragments now form a shape too consistent to ignore. The ending, then, is not resolution. It is perspective. Standing within a rhythm older than any empire, aware that what is built now becomes residue later. That memory, when carried lightly and widely, survives longer than any structure. The past does not demand belief or obedience. It demonstrates outcomes with patience. Whether those outcomes repeat unchanged depends less on fate than on attention. Civilization has always stood at the edge of forgetting. What distinguishes one configuration from the next is not brilliance, but what it chooses to remember while confidence is highest and urgency feels distant. In that choice lies the difference between repetition and continuity.